Did you know that the Church of England has an endowment fund with assets equaling £10.4 billion? And over the last 30 years, they've been averaging a return of 10% per annum. That means just in the last year alone, given these numbers, they would have achieved a return of almost £1 billion. Imagine the impact they can have with £1 billion alone. And this was the very same secret and method which powered Islamic institutions over the centuries. And that secret is Waqf. Waqf was the powerhouse, funding, powering, and transforming institutions so that they can deliver on their promises. Right from the early days of Islam, if we look at the construction of Medina and the institutions in Medina, the irrigation in Medina was powered and funded by Waqf. You had the Bi'r Ruma, which is the Waqf of Sayyiduna Uthman radiallahu anhu. He purchased this well and entire facility and garden there. That alone has over 1,000 date palms. The dates from those trees are sold. The income is then used and distributed amongst the poor and the needy. And this happens over and over again. Take, for instance, the garden of Abu Talha radiallahu anhu. Same. His garden is there for Waqf. He has hundreds of date palms, and those dates are being used to support the needy, the poor, and other people. If you look further on in history, in Andalus, Al-Hakam II, he had a Waqf, a library, which had over 400,000 books, all funded by Waqf. You had schools there, over 20-30 schools which were Waqf funded. Ibn Batuta, he writes in his travels how in Damascus, the public services, the roads, the schools, everything was powered by Waqf. In the Ottoman era, if you look at the annals of history and the records that they have, there were over 20,000 Awqaf incorporated across the lands, powering public services, schools, educational facilities, mosques, hospitals, all across the spectrum of services. It was Waqf powered. What is Waqf and what makes Waqf different from Zakat and Sadaqah? Waqf means to retain and lock an asset. So if I put an asset as Waqf, a property for instance, if I make that into a Waqf, that means that this property can no longer be sold or transferred to somebody else's ownership. It's locked, it's retained in perpetuity. So until the final day, until the last hour, nobody can make a claim on this. It's now ring-fenced for Waqf purposes. And I can allocate that I want this particular property to be a guest house. And anybody who's traveling, I want them to come stay here for free. Or I can say I want this property to be leased. The rental income, I want it to support this hospital, this school, this masjid, or this particular institution. And that will continuously happen. The house will be supporting and benefiting normal people. They'll be living in that property. But the income that's being derived, I can allocate it to beneficiaries, which I choose. Another example of a Waqf is I can have a Waqf fund where I've allocated cash as Waqf. So the initial seed capital is Waqf, just say it's £1,000. I can keep adding to that and making it grow, but £1,000 are Waqf. I invest it, say I get a 10% return, that's £100. The £1,000 must remain, but the £100 return, I can then allocate it to beneficiaries. And of course, that grows and snowballs into a huge fund across time. So this is the power of Waqf and the idea of Waqf. That's what Waqf is. And how is that different to Zakat and Sadaqah? Well, Zakat is money that's paid to specific beneficiaries, the poor and the needy, as outlined. So that money has to be transferred into the ownership of the poor and needy, and they have full authority and control over those funds to use as they see fit and to empower them. Sadaqah, again, is transfer of ownership. So if I'm raising funds as Sadaqah, I'll transfer that money into the ownership of somebody else, and they can do with it what they wish and please. But the key difference between Waqf, Zakat and Sadaqah is the idea of consumption. In Zakat and Sadaqah, when you pay somebody or you give somebody Zakat and Sadaqah, that money will be consumed. You'll have to keep raising money over and over again. Whereas Waqf, if something is designated as Waqf, that core asset or the seed capital cannot be consumed, it will remain. So instead of taking donations from people, and that donation is used to build a building or pay the expenses of something, up here the donation will remain. It'll be invested. Or you'll purchase a property and that will remain and people will benefit. So if you were to tell me that spend here once in Sadaqah and the money will be consumed and I'll have to give again next year, I'll be less likely to give in that scenario, as opposed to telling me that if you give here, your money will stay invested or will continuously benefit people. There's more of an incentive in giving in Waqf. And this is the mindset shift we have to make in people. We have to make people understand the long-term benefit, the Sadaqah Jariyah aspect in Waqf. So how do you go about setting up a Waqf? Well, the first step is you have to build a long-term vision and strategy of what are you trying to achieve? What is your institution trying to build in the long term? Once you have your vision outlined, then you do an analysis, a gap analysis. Where are you right now? What's your financial situation like? What do you need to do to achieve your ultimate goal and vision? And then you start thinking about the type of Waqf you want. Do you want us to build properties and use those properties and give them in rent? Or do you want to do something else? Or do you just want an investment fund and you just want cash? Once you've decided that, the next step is put this all down into a document and very clearly and be as flexible as possible when you're setting up your Waqf document. You want to keep it as open-ended, flexible, specify your Waqf seed capital. I always advise people to go down the cash Waqf route. It's probably the best instrument that we have today. It's very flexible. You can move around from asset to asset as opposed to having a land as Waqf. If you ever need to liquidate that, it becomes difficult. If you have cash Waqf, it's very easy because your goal is to maintain the initial seed capital as opposed to a specific property. So my advice here would be you set up a cash Waqf. In the Waqf incorporation document, in this Waqf deed, you have the initial Waqf capital, you have the trustees of the Waqf, you have the beneficiaries outlined who will be benefiting, and of course leave it open-ended. And then you start thinking about investing. Where can we invest? Low risk investments. You don't want to go into high risk investments. You want to keep low to medium risk, investing in property, land, perhaps in real estate, or even sukuk and these types of investments which are low risk and give you a modest return, enough to grow in the long term. And as the investments grow and experience is gained in the investment committee, this fund can mature and grow further. And this is really the beginning. And this will become a means of completely transforming the community, the institution, and the impact of the institution. Some good news though, Amana Advisors is working on developing a Waqf fund in the near future with some other institutions. So do look out for that. As always, this is not financial advice. This is purely for educational purposes. But we need to really have Waqf in the front of our eyes and as our goal and aim to build our institutions. If you look at the numbers behind Waqf, it'll blow you away. For instance, if you have £100,000 invested each year and you're raising £100,000 and you've invested in getting a return on investment of 7%, which is a good, modest return. Year one, you've invested £100,000, you've raised £100,000, you get a return of £7,000. 3 years later, you have £300,000 capital, your return on investment now is £21,000. 5 years later, you have £500,000 capital, but your return on investment is £35,000. 10 years later, you have £1 million capital invested. Your return now on 1 million on the 7% is £70,000. You go to 20 years later, you have 2 million invested, but now your return is £140,000. 50 years later, you have £5 million invested in capital. That value still holds, but your return now is £350,000. 100 years later, you'll have £10 million in capital. Your return on investment will be £700,000 per annum. Now you think about that. The impact, if you are receiving and gaining every single year £700,000, of course this will continuously grow and it'll snowball as the years go by, where you hit the 1 billion, 5 billion, 10 billion mark. But you have to start somewhere. So this is Waqf and something which every single institution needs to start thinking about. Amana Advisors is more than happy to advise, assist anyone looking to set up a Waqf. Don't forget to like, subscribe and share this video. I'll see you all next time.